You're about to hear a 911 call that doesn't sound real, not at first. A calm voice. Too calm. No screaming. No panic. Just control. And that's exactly what made investigators stop everything and listen again. Because what sounded like a normal emergency would soon unravel into something far darker. A story about a perfect American family hiding a truth no one saw coming. And by the time police realized what was really happening, it was already too late. This is the case that made even seasoned detectives question everything they thought they knew about appearances, trust, and what people are capable of behind closed doors. It started in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing ever really happens. Tree-lined streets, kids riding bikes, neighbors waving as they pass by. The kind of neighborhood people move to when they want safety, stability, a fresh start. At the center of it all was a family everyone admired. A husband, a wife, and their 2 young children. From the outside, they looked like the definition of the American dream. He was known as hardworking, reliable, always polite. The kind of guy who helped neighbors fix things, who never missed a day of work, who smiled just enough to make you trust him. She was warm, friendly, active in the community, always posting photos of family dinners, birthdays, little everyday moments that looked perfect. And the kids? Bright, happy, well-behaved. Teachers loved them. Neighbors adored them. Nothing about this family raised red flags. Nothing about them suggested danger. Until that call came in. It was just after 2 a.m. Dispatch received a 911 call from inside their home. The man's voice was steady. He said something was wrong with his wife, that she wasn't breathing, that he had just found her. But there was something off, something subtle, but impossible to ignore. No urgency, no fear, no confusion, just control. The dispatcher tried to guide him, asked questions, told him what to do. Is she conscious? No. Is she breathing? I don't think so. His answers were short, precise, almost rehearsed. At one point, the dispatcher told him to start CPR. There was a pause, not panic, not hesitation, just silence. Then he said, "Okay." But what came next would later become one of the most disturbing details in the entire case, because according to investigators, the sounds of CPR were wrong, too slow, too controlled, almost like someone pretending to perform it, rather than actually trying to save a life. Police arrived within minutes. What they found inside the house didn't match the calm voice they had just heard. The wife was lying on the bedroom floor, unresponsive, pale, still. The man was nearby, exactly where he said he would be. But instead of chaos, instead of desperation, there was an eerie stillness. Officers immediately took over. Paramedics rushed in. They worked fast, but it didn't take long. She was pronounced dead at the scene. At first, it looked like a tragic medical emergency. Maybe cardiac arrest, maybe something sudden and unpredictable. That's what the husband suggested, that she had been fine earlier, that everything was normal, that he had gone to bed and then woken up to find her like that. But something wasn't sitting right. Not with the officers, not with the paramedics, and definitely not with the detectives who would later review the case. Because when you've seen enough real emergencies, you learn what panic sounds like. And that 911 call? It didn't sound like panic. It sounded like performance. As the morning light crept into the neighborhood, word began to spread. Police cars, ambulances, yellow tape slowly going up. Neighbors stepped outside, whispering, confused. How could this happen here? People who had waved to this family just hours before were now watching their home turn into a crime scene. Detectives began their work immediately. They walked through the house carefully, looking for anything out of place. At first glance, everything seemed normal. No signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no obvious struggle. But as they moved into the bedroom, small details started to stand out. Things that didn't match the husband's story. The position of the body, the condition of the room, the absence of something you'd expect in a real emergency. Movement, disruption, urgency. And then there was the husband himself. Still calm, still composed, answering questions politely, but never showing the kind of emotion you'd expect from someone who had just lost their spouse. No tears, no shaking hands, no visible shock, just control. Detectives separated him and began asking more detailed questions. What happened before bed? What time did you last see her? Did she complain about anything? Any medical history? He answered everything. Smoothly. Almost too smoothly. And that's when investigators decided to go back and listen to the 911 call again. This time, they weren't just hearing it. They were analyzing it. Every pause, every word, every breath. And what they noticed changed the entire direction of the case because the timeline didn't quite add up. The way he described finding her didn't match how long it should have taken him to call 911. There were gaps, unexplained minutes, moments where something could have happened, but no explanation was given. Then came the first real break. The medical examiner's initial findings. This wasn't a natural death. There were signs, subtle but undeniable, that pointed to something else, something intentional. The case was no longer a tragedy. It was now a potential homicide. And the perfect family image? It started to crack. As detectives dug deeper, they began uncovering details the neighbors never saw. Financial stress, quiet arguments, tension behind closed doors. Nothing explosive on the surface, but enough to suggest that things weren't as perfect as they seemed. Friends were interviewed. Some described the couple as happy. Others hesitated. Said things like, they seemed fine, but what? Those buts started to matter. Because in cases like this, the truth rarely shows itself all at once. It leaks out, slowly, piece by piece. And with every new detail, the calm voice on that 911 call began to sound less like a concerned husband and more like something else entirely. By the end of that first day, investigators weren't just asking what happened. They were asking why. And more importantly, who was really telling the truth inside that house? Because sometimes, the scariest part of a case isn't what's visible. It's what's hidden behind a perfectly normal voice on a call that was never supposed to raise suspicion. And this story, it was only just beginning. If you're already questioning what really happened that night, you're not alone. Stick with me, because in the next part, we're going to break down the evidence that turned this case upside down and the detail in that 911 call that investigators say changed everything. By the time the sun fully rose over that quiet neighborhood, the tone of the investigation had completely shifted. What started as a possible medical emergency was now being treated as something far more serious. Inside the house, detectives moved slower now, more focused, more deliberate. Because once a case turned suspicious, every detail matters. They began documenting everything: the bedroom, the hallway, the kitchen, every surface, every object, every inch of space that could tell a story. And almost immediately, small inconsistencies started stacking up. The husband had said he woke up and found his wife unresponsive beside him. But the position of her body suggested something else. She wasn't in bed. She was on the floor, and not in a way that looked like a sudden collapse. It looked placed. That alone didn't prove anything, but it raised questions. Then came another detail: the bedding. Detectives noticed it was unusually neat, too neat for a situation where someone had supposedly panicked, jumped out of bed, and tried to save their spouse. No signs of struggle, no frantic movement, no disruption. It didn't match the story. And then there was the timeline. Investigators pulled phone records almost immediately, because in modern cases, phones don't just communicate, they tell stories. Texts, calls, app activity, even movement data. And what they found added another layer of doubt. The husband had claimed he went to sleep at a certain time, but his phone showed activity well after that. Scrolling, messaging, movement within the house. Not unusual on its own, but combined with everything else, it started to paint a different picture. Then came the moment that really changed everything. Detectives brought in an audio specialist to analyze the 911 call, not just to listen, but to break it down technically. They isolated background noise, measured timing between responses, studied breathing patterns, and what they found was deeply unsettling. During the call, when the husband claimed he was performing CPR, there were no clear, consistent sounds that matched actual chest compressions. No rhythm, no urgency, no physical strain. Instead, there were long pauses, moments where nothing happened, and then controlled, almost deliberate movements. It suggested something chilling, that the CPR might not have been real, that it could have been staged. Think about that for a second. Calling 911, pretending to save someone, while knowing they're already gone. That possibility alone changed how investigators viewed everything. But they needed more than suspicion. They needed proof. So they went deeper. The autopsy results came back with critical findings. There were signs of pressure around the neck. Not enough to be immediately obvious to the untrained eye, but enough for a medical examiner to recognize. This wasn't a heart attack. This wasn't a natural cause. This was consistent with strangulation. Now the case had a direction, and the focus narrowed directly onto one person, the husband. But here's where it gets complicated, because cases like this aren't solved with just one piece of evidence. They require a full picture, a motive, a sequence of events, a reason why. So detectives started looking into the marriage itself, and what they found didn't match the perfect family image at all. Behind the smiling photos and social media posts, there were cracks. Financial pressure had been building for months. Debt, bills, missed payments, things that can quietly strain any relationship. But that wasn't all. There were reports of arguments, not loud, public fights, but private tension. The kind neighbors don't hear, but can sometimes feel. Friends began to open up, at first cautiously, then more honestly. Some said the wife had seemed stressed recently, distracted, distant. Others mentioned that the husband had become more controlling over time. Again, nothing explosive on its own, but together, it started forming a pattern. And then investigators uncovered something that added a whole new dimension to the case. Another relationship. Messages on the husband's phone revealed ongoing communication with someone else. Not just casual conversation, something deeper, more personal, more secretive. Late-night texts, deleted threads, hidden contact names. It wasn't just emotional. It suggested he was living a double life. And suddenly, motive started to take shape. Because in many cases like this, when someone feels trapped, financially, emotionally, or personally, they start looking for a way out. And sometimes, that way out becomes something far darker than anyone expects. Detectives brought the husband back in for a second interview. This time, the tone was different. They weren't just asking questions anymore. They were testing him, challenging his timeline, pointing out inconsistencies, watching his reactions closely. At first, he stayed calm, just like in the 911 call, answering carefully, avoiding direct confrontation. But then, small cracks began to show, moments where his story shifted slightly. Details that didn't match what he said earlier. Nothing dramatic, just enough to raise more doubt. And in investigations like this, that's all it takes. Because truth is consistent. Lies need adjusting. As pressure built, detectives laid out some of the evidence. The phone activity, the autopsy findings, the inconsistencies in his story. And for the first time, he hesitated. Not long, just a second. But in that second, everything changed. Because up until now, he had been in control, calm, composed, careful. But now, that control was slipping. And detectives knew it. They didn't need him to confess yet. They just needed him to feel the pressure, to realize that the version of events he created was starting to fall apart. Meanwhile, outside the interrogation room, the case was gaining attention. Local news picked it up, then national outlets. Because a perfect family hiding a potential homicide? That's the kind of story that spreads fast. People across the country were listening to that 911 call, analyzing it, debating it. Some still believed him, said everyone reacts differently to trauma, that not everyone screams or panics. And that's true. But others? They heard something else entirely. Something cold. Something calculated. Something that didn't sit right. And as more details were released, public opinion started to shift. Because the deeper investigators dug, the harder it became to believe this was just a tragic accident. By the end of the second day, detectives had enough to take the next step, but they needed to be precise. Because once you make a move in a case like this, there's no going back. They gathered the evidence, reviewed every detail, built the timeline as tightly as they could, and at the center of it all was that call, that calm, controlled, almost emotionless voice, the same voice that had asked for help while possibly hiding the truth. And the question now wasn't just what happened that night. It was this: did he plan it? Or did something snap in a single moment that changed everything forever? Because in the next part, we're going to get into what detectives believe actually happened inside that house, minute by minute, and the detail that may prove this wasn't just murder, but something even more disturbing. By the third day of the investigation, detectives weren't just collecting evidence anymore. They were reconstructing a story, not the one the husband told, but the one the evidence was starting to reveal. Piece by piece, minute by minute, they began building a timeline of what likely happened inside that house. And what they found was far more disturbing than anyone expected. It started the night before the 911 call. From phone records, messages, and digital activity, investigators were able to map out the final hours leading up to the incident. The couple had been home together. No visitors. No signs of anyone else entering the house. Just the two of them and their children, asleep in their rooms. On the surface, everything seemed normal. But behind that closed front door, something was building. Text messages recovered from the husband's phone showed ongoing communication with the other woman, not just casual messages. These were emotional, intimate, and in some cases, urgent. There were conversations about leaving, about starting over, about wanting a different life. And then, one message stood out. It was sent just hours before the 911 call. Short, direct. I can't keep doing this. Detectives couldn't say for sure what that message meant in the moment. But in context, it felt like a breaking point. Because around that same time, activity inside the house changed. Data from the husband's phone showed movement late into the night, back and forth between rooms. Pause, periods of inactivity. And then, one long gap, a stretch of time where there was no phone use at all. No scrolling, no texting, nothing. Just silence. Investigators believe that's when everything happened. Inside the bedroom, away from any cameras, away from anyone who could hear. What exactly took place in those moments? Only one person truly knows. But the evidence suggests a confrontation. Not necessarily loud, not necessarily violent in the way people imagine, but controlled, focused, and intentional. The medical findings pointed to strangulation, and that matters, because strangulation isn't instant. It takes time. It requires pressure, sustained effort. It means the person responsible doesn't just act, they continue. Seconds feel like minutes. Minutes feel like something else entirely. And during that time, there's opportunity to stop, to think, to pull back. But according to investigators, that didn't happen. Instead, it continued until there was no movement left, no resistance, no sound, just silence. After that, Everything changes because now it's not about emotion anymore. It's about decision. What do you do next? And this is where the case takes an even darker turn. Because instead of calling 911 immediately, investigators believe there was a delay, a significant one, time that wasn't accounted for in the husband's original story, time where actions could be taken. And based on the evidence, they believe the scene was adjusted, the body moved, the environment reset, the bed straightened, details carefully controlled, not in a rushed panic, but in a calculated way, as if someone was trying to create a version of events that didn't reflect reality. Then, the call, that 911 call. But now, when you listen to it with this timeline in mind, it sounds different. Not like someone discovering a tragedy, but like someone reporting it. There's no shock in his voice, because the shock had already passed. No confusion, because he already knew what happened. Just a script being delivered. And the more investigators aligned the evidence with the call, the clearer that picture became. But there was still one major question left. Why? Because even with motive forming, financial stress, another relationship, those things explain pressure. They don't fully explain action. So detectives kept digging, and what they found added one final, critical piece. Insurance. Life insurance policies had been taken out. Not unusual on their own. But the timing? That's what raised concern. Recent updates, increased coverage, details that suggested planning? Not coincidence. Now, the motive wasn't just emotional, it was also financial. And when you combine those two things, escape and gain, you get something far more dangerous. Because now, this wasn't just about wanting a different life. It was about creating one, no matter the cost. Armed with this timeline, detectives prepared for the next step. They brought the husband in again. This time, they didn't hold back. They laid everything out. The phone records, the messages, the autopsy results, the inconsistencies in his story. And then they walked him through the timeline, minute by minute, explaining what they believed happened, not asking, telling. And for the first time, his composure broke. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden outburst. No full confession. But his body language changed. He shifted in his seat, avoided eye contact. His answers slowed. And then came the moment detectives were waiting for. A contradiction he couldn't recover from. Something small, but critical. A detail about when he claimed to have woken up that didn't match the data. They pressed him on it again and again and again. And suddenly, he didn't have an answer. Just silence. The same kind of silence that filled the room during that missing time gap. And in that silence, everything spoke. Because sometimes, what someone doesn't say is more powerful than anything they do. At that point, investigators knew they were close. Closer than ever. But they still needed one final move. Something that would turn this from a strong case into an undeniable one. Because in court, suspicion isn't enough. You need clarity. You need connection. You need that one piece that ties everything together. And as they reviewed the evidence one more time, they realized they might already have it, hidden in plain sight, something small, something almost overlooked, but powerful enough to change everything. And in the next part, we're going to uncover that final piece of evidence, the one that could prove, beyond doubt, what really happened that night. And the moment this perfect family story officially turned into a case that shocked the entire country. Because what came next, no one saw coming. By the time investigators reached this point, they weren't guessing anymore. They had the timeline. They had the motive. They had the inconsistencies. But what they needed now was that final, undeniable link. The piece of evidence that would turn a strong case into a certain one. And it came from something almost invisible. Something most people would never think twice about. Microscopic evidence. During a second, more detailed forensic sweep of the bedroom, technicians focused on areas that had initially seemed clean. Too clean. Because in real emergencies, especially ones involving CPR, the scene is rarely untouched. There's movement, disruption, transfer of materials. But here, there was a strange absence of all of that, which made investigators look closer. Using advanced forensic techniques, they began analyzing fibers, skin cells, and trace evidence around the victim's neck and clothing. And that's when they found it. Fibers that didn't match what she was wearing. Fibers consistent with material from inside the home, but not naturally transferred in the way the husband described. More specifically, fibers that matched fabric from a pillow in the bedroom. At first, that might not sound like much, but in context, it changed everything. Because the husband had never mentioned anything about a pillow, never said there was any object involved, he described finding her, not interacting with her in any way that would explain that transfer. But the evidence suggested otherwise. It suggested that something had been used, something soft, something quiet, something that wouldn't leave obvious marks right away. And suddenly, the medical findings made even more sense. The pressure around the neck, the lack of external trauma, the controlled nature of the scene, it all aligned. Investigators now believe that the act wasn't chaotic. It was methodical, deliberate, and, most importantly, it was concealed. When confronted with this new evidence, the husband was brought in one final time. This wasn't an interview anymore. This was the moment everything would either collapse or come together. Detectives laid it out clearly. The fibers, the autopsy, the timeline, the phone records, the 911 call. All of it. No gaps left, no room for explanation. And then they waited. At first, he said nothing, just sat there, looking down. The same man who had been so controlled, so precise, now completely still. Minutes passed, and then he spoke, quietly, no longer confident, no longer rehearsed. What followed wasn't a dramatic confession. It wasn't detailed. It wasn't emotional, but it was enough. He admitted there had been an argument. Late that night, said things got out of control, that he didn't plan it, that it just happened. But even in that moment, investigators knew the truth was more complicated than that, because the evidence didn't support a sudden loss of control. It supported time, steps, decisions, and actions taken after the fact. Still, that admission changed everything. Within hours, he was placed under arrest, charged with the murder of his wife. The news spread fast, faster than anyone expected. Because this wasn't just another case. This was the case of a perfect family falling apart in the most unimaginable way. Neighbors who once smiled and waved now stood in disbelief. Friends who saw them as happy questioned everything they thought they knew. And across the country, people went back to that 911 call, listening again, but this time, hearing it differently, not as a cry for help, but as something else entirely. A performance, a moment where the truth was hidden in plain sight. In court, prosecutors built their case around the timeline and the forensic evidence. They showed how the events didn't align with the husband's story, how the delay in calling 911 created opportunity, how the fibers connected him directly to the act, and how the calm, controlled voice on that call wasn't the voice of someone discovering tragedy, but someone managing it. The defense argued otherwise. They claimed stress, panic in a different form, a man overwhelmed by pressure. But the jury focused on the facts, the consistency of the evidence, the pattern it created, and, in the end, it led to one conclusion: guilty. Just like that, the image of the perfect family was gone, replaced by a reality no one wanted to believe. A reminder that what we see on the outside isn't always what's real, that behind closed doors, even the most ordinary lives can hide something darker. And maybe the most unsettling part of this entire case is how normal it all seemed, right up until it wasn't. Because that's what makes stories like this so difficult to process. There were no obvious warning signs, no dramatic moments that everyone could point to and say, "That's when it started." It was quiet, subtle, hidden, until it couldn't be hidden anymore. So the next time you hear a calm voice in a moment of crisis, you might think twice. You might listen a little closer. Because sometimes, it's not the panic that reveals the truth. It's the absence of it. If this story made you think, or changed the way you see things even slightly, let me know in the comments. Do you think investigators got it right? Or is there more to this case than we'll ever know? And if you want more real stories like this, the ones that stay with you long after they end, make sure you subscribe and stay with me, because the next one might be even harder to believe.